Here we go. Okay. So welcome to our study of Sefer Shemot. Most of you probably were in my class on Sefer Breshit, and that's why I picked Sefer Shemot. And a lot of times last year I used Sefer Shemot to explain Sefer Breshit, like when we did Brit Ben Avtarim. So I guess what we're going to do this year, we're going to use Sefer Breshit to explain Sefer Shemot. Now, what we did in Sefer Breshit is, since my whole contention is that Tanakh is a book about our relationship with God, and prophecy is a message from God through his prophets to his people, the main topic of every book has to be what's called Hitgalut, when God reveals himself. And when we studied Sefer Breshit, we talked about God revealing himself, first to Avram Avinu, and making him promises and giving him a destiny about his future, and how he revealed himself to, with the, every time he talked to Avram Avinu, and every time he made a brit, and every time they had conversations. And we saw when he talked to Yitzchak and to Yaakov, and then how by the time they get to the brothers, God no longer spoke to anyone, but rather talked to them through dreams and through events. And if you remember, the last time God spoke to Moshe, to anybody, was when Yaakov went down to Egypt, in Beersheba, before Yaakov went down to Israel. God told Yaakov, it's okay to go down. I'll go down with you. I'll bring you back up. He said, Yaakov, Yomer Hineni. And now, what I want to do in our study of Sefer Shemot, I want to simply study the first Hitgalut. I'm purposely skipping the first two chapters because I want to go back to the first two chapters after I've studied the first time God talks to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, I have an advantage in teaching Sefer Shemot, and that my assumption is, which I'm sure is true, that everyone in the class knows the story of Sefer Shemot. Everyone knows Moshe being born, and everyone knows the enslavement beginning, and everyone knows Moshe, killing the Egyptian and running away to Midian and marrying Tzipor and everything. Again, we're going to talk about at the book level. Those stories are important, but those stories are a lead up to Perek Gimel. Therefore, I want to begin our study of Sefer Shemot in a very careful study of Perek Gimel, which is the first time God speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu. In light of that study, I want to go back and look at the other stories, because you know those stories. You'll understand them much better once we find out what happens the first time God speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu, because my whole point is they're introductions to that first revelation, to the first Hitgalut. No. I should start with the beginning of Perek Gimel, but you'll see in a minute, I'm going to start at the end of Perek Bet. I'm going to share my screen real fast. And what I want to do in the first share is simply study with you. I want you to be part of the process of study. I want to study how the book begins, or basically how God communicates with Moshe the first time. So I'm going to share my screen, and I put in a PDF text, Sefer Shemot. We're going to start at the end of Perek Bet, and you'll see why in a minute. In fact, the end of Perek Bet is almost the Shir in Sefer Breshit. Okay, how come I don't go up? Oh, here we go. I go straight. The end of Perek Bet. Remember, in Perek Gimel, we're going to start Moshe with the burning bush. But there's 3 lines in Perek Bet that we quoted our Seder we're familiar with. It starts as follows. Vayid biyamim harabim ahim. Now, after many, many years. Yamim here doesn't mean days, it means many, many years. Okay? Vayamat Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, who was friendly with Yosef, etc. Remember? I'm sorry, the Sibud already began. This is actually very interesting. The king of Egypt died, and then there's going to be a new pharaoh. The question is, why is the death of a king going to cause extra trouble? The slavery already began, because when the bad king dies, what's the hope? That the new king hopefully will be better. But when the new king comes up, we'll see, he's no better, maybe even worse than the first. And therefore, they were hoping when this king would die, maybe things would get better. Instead, he doesn't. It doesn't get better. Bnei Yisrael groaned because of their hard work, and they cried out. And this is very interesting. A little different than what we say in Mikra Bikurim, in Aramia Vedavi. It says, Am Yisrael is crying out because of their oppression. It didn't say that they're crying out to God. What does it say? V'tal shavatam el Elohim min avodah. They were crying, they were groaning, just groaning out of oppression, and their oppression and their crying out was heard by God above. Meaning, it's not that they cried out to God. Now, in Sefer Zvarim, when we say Mikra Bikurim, we say we are in trouble. And Vanitzaka Hashem Halavatin, we cried out to Hashem our God. Now, what event is that referring to? That's a shir in Mikra Bikurim. But what's interesting here in Sefer Shemot that God hears the cry of the oppressed, even though they're not specifically crying out to God. Now, for the fun of it, does anyone know a pasuk later in Sefer Shemot that talks about that idea that God hears the cry of the oppressed, even though he's not crying out to God? Think for a minute. Anything come to mind? Okay, I guess I have to share my screen. Okay. Open up your Tanachim. If you, I mean, I hope you have your Tanakh.
Sodom and Amorah. He hears it. Here's
Ishmael.
it. Sodom and Amorah.
No, it's done. And Sodom and Amorah, that's in Sefer Breshit. We're going to get to that in a minute. There's so many,
Okay.
yeah, because Sodom and Amorah, I think we talked about that in Breshit, is the meaning of the inside the macro. I want something in Parshat Mishpatim. So if you remember, Parshat Mishpatim has two sections. Actually, we're going to spend a lot of time on it later on.
הוא שומע את ישמעאל, אפילו שזה הגר, it's Hagar who cried out, but he hears Ishmael.
Oh, yes, right, correct. But again, that's all in Sefer Breshit. That's very good. He hears about Hashem Shomed called Nar Bashar Husham. No, God hears the cry, wherever the child is. But I want something in Sefer Shemot. I'll show you. Open up Perek Chabet in Sefer Shemot. I'll share my screen. We'll share a Tanakh real fast. Hope I don't have a. Let's get to a good page here with a Tanakh open. Here we go. In Shemot Perek Chav Gimel, there's a whole set of laws, of course, you're familiar with in Parshat Mishpatim that starts in chapter 21. But in chapter 22, we have a whole set of laws that begin with in Pasuk Chaf, in verse 20. Again, Sefer Shemot. Let's get it straight. Beger lo toneh. Again, don't oppress a stranger, and don't cheat him. Ki gerim heitem beretz Mitzrayim. And the same, kol hamana b'yatom tanun. Don't take advantage of a orphan and widow. Okay. But im anet taneoto. Remember inui. If you afflict them, if you afflict a person less fortunate than you, kim tzok yitzak, if you cry out to me, I'll hear his cry. So here it sounds that if he cries out to God. But then it says, I'll get angry. And then I have to, if you take advantage of a orphan and a widow, then your wives would become widows and your children would become orphans, which is a nice way of saying, I'll punish those who punish the orphans and widows and kill them. Now, here's the main one. In kesef tavet me, should you lend money to the poor? Don't demand the money back. And if you take something for collateral, return it to them. They need it because they need, let's say they have their clothing or their bed or their blanket, whatever they need. That's the only thing they have to wear or to sleep with. Okay, here's the big line. The end of Pasuk Chavav. It'll come to pass when that person who's oppressed and feels bad cries out to me, V'shamati ki chanunani. I'm going to hear because I'm a forgiving God. Now, here we see this idea of crying out to God and God hearing their cry. So I'm pretty sure that these laws in Sefer Shemot are going to reflect this idea that God hears the cry of the oppressed. What's most amazing though is that in Mikra Bikurim, remember in Sefer Zvarim, and here also we're talking about crying out to God. It's interesting, and if I go back to Perek Chav Gimel, back to the end of Perek Bet and the introduction to Perek Gimel in Sefer Shemot, Chumash goes out of its way to say that we cry from the oppression, right? And our cry goes up to God and He hears it. Now keep that in mind, because as we're going to see, like in everything, there's always two reasons for redemption. I'll just get things started. God can redeem the Jewish people for one of two reasons. For the universal reason that God always hears the cry of the oppressed, and He comes and helps them, not for any long, historical process. And God can redeem the Jewish people because He has a destiny for them to redeem them, to make Him His people. Keep those two ideas in mind, and we'll see how they're going to play into the whole story of the Exodus. Okay, now what happens? Pasuk Abdalad. Vayishma Elohim et nakatam. God hears their cry. Vayiskor Elohim et brito et Abram et Yaakov. Vayar Elohim et bnei Yisrael v'yeda Elohim. Okay, there's a lot of verbs there, aren't there? Now, someone tell me what's special about these psukim in relation to, besides the fact that God hears their cry. What's special about our description of God in these three psukim? Anyone pay attention to something? I can highlight it in a second. Or put it, pay attention to God's name. Who hears the cry? God's name here is Elohim, correct? Vaishma Elohim benakatam. Correct? Okay. Vaiskor Elohim et brito. It's Abraham Yaakov. Vayar Elohim et bnei Israel.
It's Midat Hadin versus Midat Rachamim.
Now, I was hoping someone would say that. Why? Because we have this assumption that when we say Elohim, it means Midat Hadin, and Yud Kei Vav Kei means Midat Rachamim. Those aren't definitions of the names. Those are examples or sort of derivatives of those names. The name, remember, we just did Sefer Breshit, didn't we? Parshat Breshit and Parshat Noah. In the story of creation, the first story is Shem Elohim, and then we have a story B'Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. Remember in Gan Eden. In the flood, there's a reason why Elohim brings the flood, a reason why Yud Kei Vav Kei brings the flood. I'm sure we talked about it when we did Sefer Breshit. What's really interesting, when Sefer Shemot begins, we have Elohim coming with the reason to redeem them from Egypt. And in a minute, in the burning bush, the big Chiddush will be God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. But even though this seems to be an introduction to Elohim, to God coming and redeeming them, if you don't pay attention to God's name here, you'll miss the key point. Because as I mentioned before, Elohim, the God, remember the brit that God made, that Elohim made with Avraham Avinu was Brit Milah, and the brit that Yud Kei Vav Kei made with Avraham Avinu was Brit Ben Abtarim. They all kind of come together when we come out of Egypt. But Chumash used two names for God, usually to express two different relationships with God. The God who made nature in 7 days, who created and put man in charge with expectations for man, but a very distant God, and hence a derivative of that is going to be what's called Midat Hadin. Things go by a set of laws, like the laws of nature. And then the God who put man in Gan Eden to serve him, who has a more personal relationship with God, who can also be strict, but it can also be forgiving. God's Midot Rachamim of mercy express themselves in God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. But Yud Kei Vav Kei can also be very harsh, like we have in the Ten Commandments. Hashem can be a El Kana, he can be a zealous God, he can Pokei Davon, and he can be and not forgiving. But Yud Kei Vav Kei can forgive. Again, it's the same God. Remember Yom Kippur who said Hashem Hu Elohim. That's very key. But here we're going to have a reason, B'Shem Elohim, for God coming and hearing the people, and that's going to be a universal idea of a God who made all humankind, who expects them to be moral. Remember when before the flood, but Elohim, Elohim is angry, brings a flood and starts over again because everyone's gone corrupt. And therefore, Elohim will hear a cry of oppression simply because of corruption, not because of some, not necessarily because he has a whole historical process to do. He'll be involved in that, but the main thing is a cry of oppression. And now we're going to get to the theme of what's called Brit Ben Abtarim, of God behind our history, who's going to take us out of Egypt through miraculous historical events. So that's why I wanted to bring the background. Let's look at the verbs now. How many verbs do we have? So we hear, this Pasuk Chav Gimel describes what happened. Pasuk Chav Daled describes God's Chav Daled and Chafei, or God's reaction. God hears, Vaishma. What else? Vaiskor, he remembers. Remember that? He remembers his brit. Vayar, he sees, okay, and he knows. Now, someone mentioned beforehand the story of Sdom. Remember here we have Vayida, Vayar. He sees, he hears their cry, and he remembers his brit. Now, again, I forgot who mentioned. You mentioned the story of in Sdom. Anyone know what pasuk that is? We have almost the same verbs. Remember, I'll go back to Sefer Shemot, Sefer Breshit. In the very last conversation that God has with Avraham Avinu, the key conversation. Remember, there's two conversations. Yes, one is with Brit Ben Abtarim, and one is the story of Sdom. And so last time that God talks to himself in Sefer Breshit, remember from the beginning, God spoke to himself when he made man, and when he kicked man out of Gan Eden, and when he brought the flood, and when he decided not to bring another flood, and when he gets involved with Migdal Bavel. The very last time that God speaks to himself, and the only time he speaks to himself in regard to our forefathers, he speaks to them, but God speaking to himself was in chapter 18, in the introduction of the argument between God and Avraham Avinu about stone. So just take a look. Remember those verbs that we had? Actually, before we see them, just review them real quick. What did we say? What happened in Shemot? God heard the cry, Vayishma, Vayar, God saw, Ve'ida, he knows, and he remembered his brit. So let's take a look back in Sefer Breshit for a minute in chapter 18, in verse 20. In chapter 18, in verse 20. Chapter 18 is over here. Pasuk Chaf. Chapter 18, verse 20. God's talking to Avram Avinu, and listen what he says. Vayomer Hashem. God says, here's Yud Kivavke. Zakat stom b'marki rabba, v'chatatam ki kavla ma'od. There's a cry of oppression. There's a cry. There's a tzaka, like we had by us, coming out of stone. Erdana ve'ere. I'm going to go down and see. Remember the word I'm going down. It's going to come up later on. Hatzakatai ba'yasu kala bimlo ida. What happens? God says, I see, I hear a cry of oppression. I'm going to go down and I'm going to see the tzakata, okay? And if not, ida'ah, I'm going to know. What does it mean that God's going to know? He's going to be involved, to be intimately involved, and try to know what's going on. So we have the word yediyah, God knowing, okay? We'll talk about later God going down. Keep that in mind, guys. It goes, God says, I'm going to go down and check it out. But God, what else does God do? He hears their cry. He hears their cry and he hears their oppression. And then we talked about how later on God's got to come, and the story in stone will be very similar to what happened in Egypt, but there'll be a lot of differences. Now, there's no brit here. There's no God remembering his brit because God didn't make a brit with the people in stone to save them. But later we'll see why he saves Lot. So let's take a look at, let's go back now. In light of that, let's take a look now at the story of the burning bush. And keep those verbs in mind. They're going to come back in Perek Gimel. So that was our introduction. Now we're going to study together. Here's what I want you to do. Look in Perek Gimel. I'm going to screen share. And take a minute. Look at the first several psukim. And what I want you to do, it'll be interesting to see what you people say. Take like 2-3 minutes. Read the first couple lines, the first 5-10 lines of Perek Gimel. And what would you consider introduction? And where does God's message begin? If you want to talk to somebody, you want to start a conversation, the first thing you have to do is you have to catch their attention. And then you start talking to them. There's always a difference between getting their attention, making your first contact, and then giving them a message. What I want you to do is read. Let me make this a little bit smaller so you can see it better. Okay. In case you don't have a chumash with you, I'll just put the first. Let me make it in smaller so you can see it more. Here we go. Control small, and read the first 9-10 psukim. And where would you put the divider between God getting Moshe's attention, getting his attention, and where does God's message begin? It was what pasuk? Starting with pasuk aleph. Now, actually, I'll help you with the first pasuk. The first pasuk is simply describing the setting. Moshe's watching Yitro's sheep. He's a shepherd. And notice he goes to what mountain? The mountain of Elohim. Why it's called Har Elohim, that later is going to become Har Sinai. We'll see that later on. Okay. Now, so start from pasuk bet, and you can write into the chat. Let me turn this off here. And just write what pasuk, when you go through it, what pasuk does God's message is going to begin God's message, and where is he only getting his attention? You'll see in a minute why it's so important. You can either take a minute.
Pasuk Dalet.
Okay, so when you have an answer, write it in the chat real fast, or save it when I'm going to ask. But everyone think on their own. At what pasuk does God's message begin to Moshe Rabbeinu? So where does he catch his attention, and where does his message begin? I'll make it a little bit smaller so you can see a little more. Okay. Open the chat real fast. There we go. Okay. Here's the chat. Here we go. Okay. Oh, people reading in Hebrew. Okay, that's good. Okay, I knew this was going to happen. Okay, we'll wait for 2 or 3 more answers. So far, I heard pasuk vav and pasuk zayin. take another minute and then we'll take a vote on them. So far I heard Pasuk Daled, Pasuk Vav, and Pasuk Zayin. And each one has its merit. Okay, and anybody else want to answer? Everyone's quiet today. Okay, let me put on. See if anyone else wants to vote real fast. Okay, let's take a look more. Okay, Daledy gets his attention. Okay, that's for sure. Okay, and the message begins. So it's either Pasuk Vav or Pasuk Zayin so far. So we'll check it out now in a minute. Okay. I'll share with you something interesting. What does God do to get Moshe Rabbeinu? Remember with Avram Avinu? The first time God talked to Avram Avinu, we just talked out of nowhere. Remember, God told him, Lech Lecha. But when they had their conversation, remember God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, don't worry, no, I'm going to protect you. And then Moshe says, what's going on? We'll probably go back to that very soon and see how God gets Avram Avinu's attention. But watch what happens here. How does God get his attention? By the burning bush. What does he do? There's a bush that's burning. Remember? There's a bush that's burning and it's not being eaten up. Anyone have an idea what event that's going to represent later on? It was what event later in Moshe's life, in the history of the Jewish people, is that going to be similar to where something's going to be on fire, but not being
Sinai, Har Sinai.
And what did Har Sinai?
It was on fire. The flames were coming out of Har Sinai, but didn't get burnt up.
Was anyone consumed?
Yeah.
Okay, so take a look again.
Not straight away.
Yeah. First of all, when people realize there's a malach in the burning bush. It's not God. There's a malach. It's a messenger of God in the burning bush. Okay, and Moshe looks and sees the bush is burning and not being eaten up. The best example. Remember all these words being eaten up? Take a look. It's so neat. It's not actually Moshe. It's about Moshe Rabbeinu, but it's the people when they're talking about him. If we go to Sefer Zvarim, Perek Hey. Remember the 10 Commandments in Sefer Zvarim? When the people beg Moshe Rabbeinu, we want you to go and get the laws. We don't want to stand here at Har Sinai anymore. They've had it. Look what they tell him. In Perek Hey, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. What's it say here? In Pasuk Vayikashamachem, when you heard God's voice coming from the fire, okay? And what do you call it? The fire was burning. The har bo'er ba'esh. The fire was. I can make this bigger now. Okay. Oh, that's too big. So you heard it following, and then Tamru, you told Moshe Rabbeinu, you saw God's glory. Okay. We heard God's voice from the fire, and now we know that God can speak and people can live. Now, listen to the words. We're going to be consumed. We see this fire. We heard God from the fire, but we're going to be consumed by the fire. The fire is going to eat us up. Because who could possibly hear the voice of God speak and stay alive? Instead, what you go and hear everything God says, because you can survive. Meaning, the way the people view Moshe Rabbeinu is he's someone who can stand in a fire of God that appear to be consumed, but not be consumed by fire. So it's really interesting, and this is happening at Har Sinai. So the first image that Moshe Rabbeinu sees at the burning bush, which later becomes Mount Sinai, of a consuming fire with someone mortal is going to be able to survive, something organic like that burning the bush, the snem, is the same thing's happening. The same sign that God gives Moshe Rabbeinu in the very beginning is already going to be a precursor to what's going to happen in Mount Sinai. Now, let's go back down and see what God's message is. The boring part hopefully is over. Sorry, stop share and go now to, not the chat, but to screen share and the text in Zvarim. Okay. So he gets his attention. Okay? What's Moshe say? Asura never hamar hagdolazem adol lo ydarsnem. That's Moshe's inquisitive. He doesn't just say, he sees something that doesn't make sense. Now remember, when he was growing up, he saw injustice, he does something about it. He saw injustice in Egypt, he gets involved. He saw injustice in Midian, he gets involved. Now he sees injustice in nature. Something doesn't make sense. That sneh is burning. He's inquisitive. What's going on? And there's the Vayar Hashem Kisali wrote. And so it's such great wordplay. God sees that he's going now to see. Okay? And now God says, "Oh, I have a candidate now." And then God calls out to him from the bush, saying, "Moshe, Moshe, v'yomer hineni." Remember, that's parallel to the last time God spoke to anybody with Yaakov, Yaakov, v'yomer hineni. But now, God didn't give him a message yet, but that's the first time that God talks to him. That's how he gets his attention. Right? And he says, what? He says, don't come close. Instead, take your shoes off. Okay? Because this land you're standing on is Kodesh. It didn't translate holy. It's designated for something. It's separated. Now, ask most people. I should have done this in the beginning. Almost everyone has heard of the burning bush narrative. What almost everyone remembers in classic Jewish education, yes, what happened at the burning bush? They'll remember Moshe took his shoes off. Either because of the Haftarah from Yeshua on that we read about Yericho, that God tells Moshe and Yeshua to take his shoes off also. But what's interesting, it's probably the least important detail of the burning bush narrative, and it's the thing that everyone remembers because it's the way God gets his attention. He tells him, take your shoes off. I'll tell you why people relate to it, because it's in our day-to-day lives. You go into someone's house, take your shoes off, means relax. We're going to have a conversation, or we're going to have a relationship going on. But it's a way of saying, make yourself at home. Now, why did Moshe take his shoes off? It's preparation for Nevuah. There's so many laws we learn from here. Like in the Beit HaMikdash, we don't wear shoes in the Beit HaMikdash for the same reason. Because God's presence is there, you take your shoes off. The Kohanim, when they duchen, they take their shoes off. Now, so everyone agrees that here God's getting his attention. The argument you have was between Pasuk Vav and Zayin. Let's see Pasuk Vav now. Vayomer Anochi Elohei Avicha. I'm the God of your father, Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov. The God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We say something very similar in Shemona Esrei. Now, and Moshe, what's Moshe do? Moshe hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. So God is being spoken through his malach in the burning bush. Moshe hears the voice, but he's afraid to look at where the voice is coming from. Now, why does God identify himself in this way? Now, go back for a second. What I want to suggest is Perek Vav is still getting Moshe's attention because there's no message in Perek Vav, even though there might be. What's God saying? Is Perek Vav God identifying himself who he is? Or is that part of the message? We'll discuss that soon. But what's God say? I'm the God of your forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Moshe is afraid of him. Now, has God ever talked to Moshe Rabbeinu before? Not, it doesn't say anywhere in Chumash. But what does this assume? That Moshe is aware of the God of his forefathers. Moshe has a Jewish education. For example, let me just chart this with you. How does Avram Avinu find out that the reason his father was a Zionist wasn't because his father was a Zionist, Terach, but rather because God wanted him to leave Egypt? If you remember what we read in the end of Parshat Noach, Parshat Lech Lecha begins when Avram is already in Haran. I go back to Sefer Breshit. Remember, it's like I call Terach the first Zionist for a good reason, because he's the first Zionist. He's moving to Israel, not because God told him to, but because he wants to move to Eretz Canaan. Remember the end of chapter 11? In the end of chapter 11 in Breshit, Terach makes Aliyah. We have all the genealogies of Shet down to Terach. Terach, remember, has three sons, Abram, Nachor, and Haran. And Haran had Lot, and Haran dies. And Abram and Nachor get married, etc., like we know. And then, Pasuk Lamed, Vaikach Terach et Abram beno, v'et Lot ben Haran, ben Beno, Terach and his family make aliyah on the way to aliyah. As they joke around, they stay in Tinek or they stay in Haran. They don't make it there. Only their kids make aliyah. So Terach is in Haran, but the reason why Abram leaves Ur Kasdim, the reason why he leaves Ur Kasdim, is because his father took him on a journey. But Terach died in Haran. Now, then God tells Abram Lech Lecha in Perek Yud Bet. Abram's already in Haran when God tells Abram Lech Lecha mi'artzecha, etc. When does Abram find out that it was God was behind Terach making aliyah? That's not in Perek Tet Vav. That's not until Perek Tet Vav, and when God has his first conversation with Abram Avinu. What does God say? God identifies himself in a very similar manner. What does he say? In Pasuk Zayin, Vayimar Elav, Ani Hashem, Asher Osotticha Me'or Kasdim. The reason you left Ur Kasdim, I'm the God who took you out of Ur Kasdim, and the reason I took you out was to promise you this land, to begin this nation in this land. So Avram finds out the way that God appears to Avram Avinu and identifies himself. He's telling him, I'm the God behind your father's aliyah. It was me who was behind that event. It wasn't just by chance. Now, God can't tell Avram, I'm the God of creation, or I'm the God of your father Terach, because he can't relate to that. When God identifies himself the first time, you have to identify in something you can relate to. For example, the first time that God, when God appears to Yitzchak, what does he tell him when he, we're still in Breshit, in Perek, should be in Perek Havav. There's Perek Havav. Perek Havav, after those events with all the Beirut. What does God tell? Here. He goes to Beersheba, Yitzchak, in Pasuk Havdal in Perek Havav. Vayera elav Hashem b'layla hu v'yomer, Anochi Elohei Abraham Avicha. Who am I? I'm the God of Abraham, your father. That Yitzchak can relate to. Al tira, don't worry, ki t'chanochi b'rachtecha b'beit Yizarcha b'avur Abraham Avti. So God identifies himself to Yitzchak as the father of Abraham. And everyone should know the beginning of Parshat Vayetze. If you look in Perek Chavchet in Breshit, in Pasuk Yud, the beginning of Parshat Vayetze, how does God identify himself to Yaakov? It should be right here, Pasuk Yud, I'm sorry. And he by Chalom, there's a Sulam. And then what's the first thing God tells him? V'nei Hashem nitzav alav. V'yomer, Ani Hashem Elohei Avraham Avicha v'Elohei Yitzchak. The first time God speaks to Yaakov, how does he identify himself? I'm the God of Abraham and Yitzchak. How come? Because he knows the story of God appearing to his forefathers. Yitzchak knows the story of God talking to Abraham Avinu. Abraham knows the story of his aliyah from Ur Kasdim. So it's important to me because Moshe Rabbeinu is aware of his heritage. He's not someone who grew up in Pharaoh's house and doesn't know anything about his Judaism. He's not a total outsider. When God tells him, I'm the God of Abraham, your father, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and your forefathers, Moshe is totally aware of our Jewish traditions. He's from Shevet Levi, it's a Jewish education. And therefore, God doesn't only get his attention by the burning bush, he tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm the God of your forefathers. And Moshe now knows who he's talking about. Now comes, I still think that Pasuk Vav is still part of his introduction. It's going to relate to the message, but the message is going to begin in Perek Zayin. Okay, in Pasuk Zayin. So let's take a look now in Pasuk Zayin. V'yomer Hashem, we're now back in Perek Gimel, Pasuk Zayin. V'yomer Hashem, Ra'or ra'iti et oni ami asher b'Mitzrayim. Let's follow the verbs. What's God say? God sees. Right? God sees. I see what? The oppression of my people in Egypt. Let's count the verbs again. God sees, and here God's name is Yud Kei Vav Kei. I see the oppression. I hear their cry. Shomei tzaka. He hears their cry. And what else? Shomei tzaka. Ki yadati et machovav. Now, if I go back to, it's here, already, see the three? Yud Kei Vav Kei is saying, I see their oppression, I hear their cry, and I know their pain. If I go back up to the end of Perek Gimel with God's name Elohim, what do we have? We had what? God, okay, Am Yisrael cried out. By Shema Hashem, we have Shemea Tzaka. God hears their cry. We have Shmiya. I like that. We have Shmiya. We don't have Vayizkor by us. We don't have remembering the Brit. That's going to come later on. Okay. We have Vayar, God sees. And we have Vayah, and God knows. So notice 3 of the 4. We have 4 verbs with Elohim. Only 3 of them now with Yud Kei Vav Kei. This Chirat Brit is going to come up in Parshat Vayera. We'll see later, but it's even going to come up soon in the burning bush as well. So we'll see. But pay attention to that. I just want to point out that just like in Breshit, we have a story beginning with Shem Elohim and Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. The 2 stories of creation that talk to each other and build up our relationship with God. There's going to be 2 different stories, 2 different perspectives of why God's going to take us out of Egypt. One b'Shem Elohim and now one b'Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. But now listen, what's God say? I heard their cry. That we had by stone. Remember, God's going to come down now to save them from Egypt and bring them to the promised land. We'll see later on, it's all from Ben Abtarim. Okay. What's God saying? I heard their cry. I see their suffering. Therefore, I'm going to go down now and save them and bring them out of Egypt. Now, why does Moshe need to know this? Keep that in mind. This is God's message to Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm coming to redeem my people. Now, let's look at Pasuk Tet. What's wrong with Pasuk Tet? Look at Pasuk Tet for a minute. And now the cry of Bnei Yisrael is coming to me because I've seen their oppression. Okay. If you were reading, what bothers you about Pasuk Tet? Anything? I'm stop this here for a minute. Look at Pasuk Tet. What does Pasuk Tet add?
The Wi-Fi?
Then go ahead. Who's speaking? Dvorah? Right here. Someone was saying something. Yeah,
how the Egyptians oppressed them, in addition to hearing their cry.
Yeah. What is Pasuk Tet parallel to?
But should it be before Chet?
Exactly. Look at Pasuk Tet and Pasuk Zayin. Look at Tet and Zayin, and look how similar they are. What's God say? I saw their oppression, right? Etani, I saw their oppression. Got it? What else? I heard their cry, and I feel their pain, and I'm going down to save them. What do we add in Pasuk Tet? And now I heard their cry again, and I see the oppression. It's the same thing. God hears their cry. He's Shomea Tzaka, and he sees their oppression. What is it in Pasuk Tet that we didn't have in Pasuk Zayin? Now, let's read that Pasuk Yud. Vatalacha, now you go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh, and take my people out of Egypt. Here's what I want you to do. Let's just translate real quick. And now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh, take my people out of Egypt. Now, look at Pasuk Tet again. Does Pasuk Tet belong with Pasuk Chet, Zayin Chet, or with Pasuk Yud? Now, if you had to take, remember what we did all the time? Let me go back a little bit here. If I need to put in quotation marks, this is God. God introduces himself in Pasuk Vav, but right here is where God, let me put a quotation mark here. God's opening message to Moshe Rabbeinu, not his introduction, but his opening message is Pasuk Zayin. God starts talking in Pasuk Zayin with his message. Now we got Moshe's attention and knows what God is talking to him. And he speaks from Pasuk Zayin to Pasuk Yud. Through here. These psukim, maybe a little bit better. Let's make a little line here. Here we go. From here to here is God speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu. We'll see Moshe's reaction in a minute. This is God talking to Moshe Rabbeinu for the first time with a message. Now, look at these psukim from pasuk Zayin to Yud. How would you divide them up? Is there logic in dividing them into two parts? There was pasuk Tet goes backwards or forwards?
Forwards.
Yeah. And what's it doing? It's introducing pasuk Yud, isn't it? Look at this. What's God say? God says, I heard their oppression, and therefore, what am I doing? According to pasuk Het, who's going to take him out
Says
of
he's going to
Egypt?
go down.
Yeah.
In
God's going
pasuk-
to come and take him out of Egypt. And what's he tell him in pasuk Yud?
You go down to Egypt, not me.
Did anyone ever notice that before? God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, listen carefully. God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I've seen the cry of oppression, therefore I'm going to take them out of Egypt. And then he tells him, I hear their oppression, and therefore you take him out of Egypt. So make up your mind. You understand my question? Who's going to take us out of Egypt, God or Moshe Rabbeinu?
God through Moshe.
Okay, but it won't be so simple. But it's important to pay attention to this introduction. Got it? The first thing God tells Moshe Rabbeinu is what? I've seen their cry, and therefore I'm going to take them out of Egypt. And then God says, I heard their cry, therefore you take them out of Egypt. Like, you understand the hashkafa behind this? How does God do things?
With
God
partners.
does things, but God needs an agent to help them do things. And Moshe is going to be his agent. Now, put yourself in Moshe's position. Usually I used to joke around and say, put yourself in Moshe's sandals, but you can't say that here because he's not wearing shoes. He's not wearing shoes. So that's it. Put yourself in Moshe's position. He's barefoot. Now, if you heard this from God, I purposely want to stop right here. God just told Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm the God of your forefathers. That means he knows about Brit Ben Abtarim. He knows about, he knows the history of the Jewish people. He knows one day they're going to be redeemed. He doesn't know when it's going to start because, the 400 years, what's it come from? There's different ways of calculating when they should expect redemption. But God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I've heard their cry. I'm coming to take them out of Egypt and keep my promise to the forefathers. Now, they say, I heard the cry, therefore you take them out. When God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you take them out, give me two directions and how Moshe can respond to this. God told Moshe Rabbeinu, now you go and take him out. I'm going to repeat that. I want to hear, you guys, I need a little more participation. What happened today? God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I heard their cry, I'm going to take them out. I heard the cry, therefore you take them out. Give me different directions, not specific responses. I want direction of response. When someone gives you a job to do, what can you ask in response?
Why are you doing it?
Okay, there's basically you can say why me,
Why me? Yeah.
or basically what we do in life. You can say, oh, why should I do it as opposed to let someone else do it? Ask your kids, do this. No, why can't Johnny do it instead of Moshe? But why do I have to do it? Someone else's job, or why can't you do it yourself? One direction could be. What? Why me? Or basically give a reason why he doesn't want to take the job. Got it? What could be another approach?
And ask for clarification.
What do you mean by clarification?
What you mean, me?
What do you mean? No.
Plan of action.
Say that again.
Why me, Lord?
Okay, you could say why me, but that's a reason why not to do it.
Right.
What other direction could he go in?
Not up
You
to
want
it.
me to do it?
I can't do it.
I'm
He can
not
say I can't do
deserving.
it. That's another reason I can't do it. You can say why me? Why not somebody else? Or I can't do it.
I'm not
Okay, I'll
deserving.
do it. I'll do it. Just how am I going to do this?
Or it could be how. Now listen, most people when they study this, they see Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to get out of a job. Agreed? Isn't that how we always learned it? Moses is reluctant to take the job, and it's supported later on. But there's two ways to read this here. Moshe could be saying, I don't give reason why he doesn't want to do it, or he could he'd be asking how to do it. It could be, I want to do it, but how am I supposed to do it? Got it? Keep that in mind. Let's see now. Let's read this open. What's Moshe going to respond? Let me just check the chat real fast. Okay. Okay. Now, how can I? Or it's like, how can I, as opposed to why I can't. Is he explaining why he can't do it, or why, or how can he do it? So let's see what Moshe says now. Soon we'll get a chart. Okay. Let's read what Moshe says. God says, go take my people out of Egypt. Okay. Vaymer Moshe Elohim. Mi anochi ulecha paro. Okay. Moshe says, who am I to go to Pharaoh? V'chiyotzi b'nei Yisrael b'mitzrayim, and I can take them out? What's Moshe seem to be saying? Is that how can I do it? Or why, or I can't do it?
I'm not worthy.
It sounds like, who am I to go to Pharaoh? No, how can I not? He's not saying practically. He says, I'm not the guy for the job. I can't do it. He's saying, I can't do the job. And I can take him out of Egypt. That's one way to read it. That's what he could be asking. He could give a reason why he doesn't want the job, or why he can't take the job. Or we'll see in a minute, he could be asking a question. But you agree with him, the pasuk Yud is very cryptic. Moshe tells God, now we're not doing this now today, but pay attention. All through the burning bush narrative, the narrator describes God as Yud Kei Vav Kei, but Moshe sees him as Elokim. Got that? Moshe goes to higher Elokim. Moshe is relating to Elokim, and the narrator is talking about Yud Kei Vav Kei. And we'll see in a minute how God identifies himself. We'll probably won't get to that till next week, though. Just keep that in mind. You have to pay real careful attention when you read the burning bush narrative. What Chumash calls God's name, how Moshe views God, and how God reveals himself, what God says. So, who am I to go to Pharaoh? And can I take them out of Egypt? I'm sorry. Now, what's God say? Vayomer ki yemach, I'll be with you. And here's the sign that I'm sending you. Okay. When you take the people out of Egypt, serve me on this mountain. Let's read the Hebrew. Vayomer ki yemach, I'll be with you. And this is the sign that I'm sending you. When you take the people out of Egypt, serve me on this mountain. Everyone agree with me the pasuk Yud Bet is out of nowhere? What's the connection between pasuk Yud Bet and pasuk Yud Aleph? If Moshe is saying, I don't want the job, or I can't do the job, what's God saying? Don't worry, I'll be with you. Here's the sign. And what do you do when you take the people out of Egypt? Serve me on this mountain. I simply want you to pay attention how there's no flow in this pasuk. There's no connection between pasuk Yud Aleph and Yud Bet. But let me show you I'm going to switch now to a chart. No, I don't have to stop the share. It's just the next file. Where is it? Should be here. No, that's 3. Not this one. Not this one. I thought I had it up there. 1 second. Let me stop the share for a second. And I sent it on the source sheet. Let me just share my screen. Let me put it up online one more time. Chumash and Shemot 3 landscape. Here we go. Open this up. There we go. And share my screen now. How do I share my screen? Share screen, and here we are. Okay. Now I made it nice and big. And I share this with the thing. Take a look at these psukim again, and I'm going to show you how Rashbam is going to set them up. God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, the last thing after his introduction, God told Moshe Rabbeinu, pasuk Yud, now I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Okay, take my people out of Egypt. Moshe is going to respond to each half. God tells him 2 things. You go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Take my people out of Egypt. Moshe is responding to, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? We'll see, is this a how or why not me? And then he asks, can I take them out of Egypt? But follow the otzi, see that? Just look at the verbs. I'm sending you. Okay, lacha elech. God told Moshe, there's no doubt that pasuk Yud Aleph is responding to pasuk Yud. Agreed? God says, go to Pharaoh, take my people out of Egypt. Moshe is saying, who am I to go to Pharaoh? And can I take them out of Egypt? I could read this as Moshe saying, why he doesn't want the job. Or he could be asking how to do the job. He's saying, I would love to go, but what?
I don't know
How are
how.
you going to take me in? Yeah. I can go to Pharaoh. Who am I? I'm a runaway convict. Got it? Who am I to go to Pharaoh? And let's say I get to Pharaoh. Can I take him out of Egypt? Or maybe how do I take him out of Egypt? It could be saying why he doesn't want the job. He could also be asking how to do the job. But listen to God's answer. Okay. God tells him, I'll be with you. And here's the sign that I'm sending you. See, shlachtecha. See the perfect match? We'll see in a minute the Rashbam. He's going to match all these up. Rashbam's going to point out how the first thing God says matches the first thing Moshe says, the first thing God answers. Okay? Let's read each column by itself. I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? He says, don't worry, I'll be with you. And here's a sign that I'm sending you. Go out. We'll see in a minute. I'll take care of it. And then he says, take my people out of Egypt. Moshe is going to ask, not who am I to take them out, but how do I take them out? And this is the strangest answer, but it's definitely related. Hotzei, v'chiotzi, v'otziacha. Is when you take them out of Egypt, serve me on this mountain. Now listen carefully. This is going to be, the whole show is building up to this. Hope I didn't lose you. What's Moshe saying? I want to claim, I'm going to follow Rashbam in a minute. The Moshe is not saying I don't want the job. He's saying I would love to do the job, but how can I possibly do it? How can I possibly get the audience of Pharaoh? How can I possibly take the Jews out of Egypt? So what's God say? Don't worry about it. I'll get you in. I'll get you the code to go into his house, to this Pharaoh. Don't worry about it. I'll be with you. I'm sending you. How to take them out? What? This is crazy. When you take them out, serve me on this mountain. Moshe didn't ask. This isn't the question Moshe asked. Moshe didn't ask, what do I do when we get out? Look how it doesn't make sense. God says, take him out of Egypt. How do I take him out? Oh, after you take them out, serve me on this mountain. And that's why Rashi is going to change the question and saying, in what schut, or for what purpose, or what makes them worthy to take them out of Egypt? God says, Moshe is asking, are they worthy of coming out of Egypt? And God's answer is, the purpose of Yitzhak Mitzrayim is to serve me on this mountain. That's Matan Torah. Rashbam's going to go in a totally different direction. And listen carefully what Rashbam is going to say. Rashbam claims this is how to take them out of Egypt. You with me? Moshe is asking, I want the job. This, how am I going to get it done? God says, I'll get you Pharaoh's audience. I'll get you in. God says, take him out. Moshe, how to take him out? God says, tell a lie. Go tell Pharaoh that what? That we have to serve God on the mountain. And that's how to get him out of Egypt. Moshe is asking a practical question. What's the strategy? How am I going to take a whole nation out of Egypt? And God's answer is, what do you tell, when you get to Pharaoh's palace, what do you tell him? We have to serve our God on the mountain, a 3-day distance in the desert. Anyone follow that? We're going to read the Rashbam in a minute inside. But what Rashbam is saying, Moshe is not trying to get out of the job. God's explaining to Moshe Rabbeinu how to get the job done. And what's the best strategy? Lie? What? To lie.
Why is it a lie?
And we'll get to that. All the Parshim are going to ask that question. Why is he telling him a lie? So he'll say in a minute, it's called, sort of he's saying, Paro did Hava Nitzchach below, let's outsmart them and enslave them. So God's going to give them that.
Part of it. They do need to serve them, but they're just not going to go back.
Yeah. So it sounds like a big lie, but let me explain the big Rashbam. Rashbam's going to claim, and it's going to be amazing Rashbam, we'll see in a minute. He's going to claim that this opening message to Moshe Rabbeinu is not God saying, Moshe, take my people out, and Moshe, I don't want to do the job, and trying to get out of it. And God saying, no, do it anyhow. Moshe wants the job and is willing to take the job. He just wants to know how to get it done. And God's giving him the master plan for Yitzhak Mitzrayim. Number one, God's saying, you don't have to do it for me, you'll do it with me. You want to get into Pharaoh's office? I'll get you into Pharaoh's office. Leave it to me. Don't worry, I'll be with you, I'll help you. Now, let me give you one quick analogy, and then we'll get to what Rashbam is saying. When God tells Moshe, take them out of Egypt, I'll give you an example. When God tells Yeshua, conquer the land of Israel, Yeshua has to make his own battle plans, and God will help them if trouble comes up. But Yeshua calls the place. Okay? When Moshe takes Am Yisrael out of Egypt, God is going to make the master plan. Moshe is the man on the ground. Moshe has to execute the plays, but it's not Moshe's job to make the strategy. God's telling Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll be with you, meaning you don't have to, it's not your job to make the strategy. I'm going to take him out of Egypt. Remember those two things God's saying? I heard the cry differ. I'm going to take them out. I heard the cry differ. You take them out. God's saying, I have the master plan. I'll take them out. I need someone down on the ground to run the play. I have this. It's not your job to take them out. It's your job to help me take them out. But I need an agent down on the ground helping me out. Because God can't appear to Pharaoh. Moshe can appear to Pharaoh. God is going to tell Moshe what to do. God's not going to tell Moshe Rabbeinu how many plagues there's going to be. God doesn't tell Moshe the whole plan. He's going to give him the overall strategy. But God's going to be calling the plays. Moshe's going to execute them. If you know American football, God's the head coach and Moshe's the quarterback. But Moshe's the quarterback that's not calling the plays. He's executing the plays. The head coach tells them, whether they're going to run, they're going to pass, whatever they're going to do. If you know your sports, hope that analogy helped a little bit. There's a difference between Moshe, it's your job to take them out. You break your head and figure it out. Or Moshe, I'm going to take them out of Egypt. That's what God told him in Pasuk Zayin Chet. I heard the cry of I'm going to take them out. But to help me take them out, I need you to run the play. Therefore, don't break your head how to do it. That's my problem. I'll be with you. I'll tell you what to do. How to get it done? Here's a master plan. The first thing you do, tell Pharaoh, you have to serve our God on our mountain. What's the plan? I mean, the plan's obvious. Lie to him and say, we're not leaving for good. What are we doing? We're going to serve our God. Remember, we're going to see that theme all through the Exodus. Moshe only tells Pharaoh, Moshe never says, let my people go. He only says, let me take them out. Let's go worship our God. And the plan is, let's get out of Egypt with the excuse of religious freedom. And once we're out of Egypt, we're going to exit and go to Israel and not come back to work. That seems to be the plan. Now, we're going to read the Rashbam now in a minute, and then we'll see it inside. Did I turn off my share screen? Yeah. So let's see the Rashbam. Where's the Rashbam? The Rashbam is right here. I have it on the source sheet. Let me do it with a Rashbam. I'm going to put it online in a second. I just got to share my screen again. And get used to my computer here. Here we go. Rashbam. Oh no. Rashbam. I got too many Rambams and enough Rashbams. Rashbam. Here we go. Rashbam 3. About 311. Here we go. I have it nice big letters here. Why didn't it open up? Oh, and I have to share my screen again. Here's the Rashbam. Share screen, and here we go. This Rashbam is dynamite. Listen to what he says. Shmot Per Gimel. Have it? This is how he begins. Everyone see the screen? I'll make it bigger. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, this is how he begins. Rashbam was in a great mood when he wrote this, because if you really want to understand what's going on in these psukim, okay, pay attention to my explanation. Listen to what he says. He says, Rashbam, remember Rashi's grandson? He's referring to his grandfather, saying, the earlier commentators before me didn't understand what's going on. That's why this shit was so confusing, I hope. Everyone's so used to the burning bush narrative as Moshe being reluctant to take the job. He says, no one pays attention to what's really going on here. Why? And now he explains what we did in class. He says, Moshe Shiv al Shnei Zvarim B'Yomer Shamar L'Akadosh Baruch Hu. God told him two things. Remember? Let's take a look at the chart again, real fast. Rashbam's referring to this. Not this one, to this one, not this one. What happened to? Oh, here it is. Moshe referring to, God told him, you go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Remember Pasuk Yud, the two things? Moshe answers the two things, and God answers Moshe's two things. Got it? Now watch how Rashbam's going to divide it up. Here we go. Rashbam. Here we are. Okay. Moshe Shibla Shein to go to Pharaoh and to take Am Yisrael out of Egypt. How did Moshe respond in Pasuk Yud? Okay. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? Moshe Shiv, who am I to go to Pharaoh? Yeah. What? Afilu lavilo mincha v'doron ki roi adid lekenes lachatzer hamelech ish mapri kamoni. Who am I to go to his palace? I can't get in. Can I take Am Yisrael out of Egypt? Okay. Even if I get in, right? Is he an idiot to let them out? Okay. He's asking me, saying, what logical thing can I tell him that'll let me go out of Egypt? Okay. It says, "V'chishoteu paro lishmo alei lishloch am rav shem avadav chavshim me'artzo." Is he an idiot, Pharaoh? If I take my people out of Egypt, to go. And then Moshe is asking, give me a strategy. What logical thing can I tell him to get the people out of Egypt? Moshe is asking how to get the job done. And Kadosh Baruch Hu tells him as follows. I'll be with you. I'll help you get in. I'll get you his audience. He'll let you into his palace. And what's the sign I'm with you? That's the burning bush. Okay. And you're afraid of going in. You might go, he might kill you, whatever it is. He might, convict you from your previous crime. And you're going, don't worry, I'm sending you. And don't you see the burning bush? That's a sign to you that I sent you. Okay. And what do you call it? And the same thing brings an example from Gidon. He says, don't worry, he gives him a sign. Okay. And now, and how about the question, how to take him out of Egypt? What can I tell him? The Paro will take them out. He says as follows: when you take them out of Egypt, I'm commanding you now that you serve God on the mountain and you bring me korbanot. Now, this is what he says. This is something that you could tell him. Ask for religious freedom. Maybe he'll let them go. Maybe he'll fall for it. Even though it sounds very cryptic here, what's he say? We'll see in a minute. We'll have to continue this next week. God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, the people will hear your message that God's coming to save them, and go to Pharaoh together with the elders of Israel and tell them we need to go a three-day journey in the desert. And then he said, what's he saying? He says, if you follow the story of the Exodus, and we're going to check this out, it's going to take us a lot of time, but every single time Moshe goes to Pharaoh, he'll never ask for freedom, not once. Despite all the movies, despite everything, everyone always learns. Moshe never says, let my people go free. He never says, we want to go to the promised land. He does that to the Jewish people. He doesn't tell that to Pharaoh. What does he tell Pharaoh? He says, let my people go to serve me. He's asking for religious freedom to go out to a 3-day distance to the desert to serve their God. And that God should give them that Pharaoh should give them that permission. And first Pharaoh says no, but little by little, God convinces Moshe Rabbeinu, with God's help, through the plagues, convinces Pharaoh to send them out to serve their God in the desert. To the very end, we're going to see, Moshe never asked for freedom. And we'll see, we'll follow that. Even after the 10th plague, when Pharaoh sends them out of Egypt, does he send them out to serve their God, or does he send them out to go to, is he send them out to go and serve their God, or setting them out free? We're going to follow that story to the very end. Now, one last point Rashbam makes, and we'll finish with this. People ask, how can you lie? So Rashbam doesn't explain why lying is okay. He's going to bring an example, precedent that happened later on, that it's okay to lie in a situation like this. Why? God told Shmuel to go appoint David king. Okay? God tells Shmuel to do something that's dangerous, that's treason against the king. And Shmuel asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu, okay, if Shaul hears about it, he'll kill me if I go anoint David. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, you know what? Go tell Shaul, go tell the king, that what are you doing? You're going to bring a korban. Means you can use a religious excuse to do something political. Which is, we'll deal with this question later on. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling him, lie, but as a lie, use religious freedom. Let's say you want to bring a korban, okay? But he calls it afkan der chokhmah. This is wisdom. This is like he's outsmarting him, and take him out of Egypt. Okay, you can tell them that. It's basically Rashbam on these psukim. He's saying the only way to understand this conversation. That's why I spent so much time on it. There's this dialogue, the first dialogue between God and Moshe Rabbeinu, where Moshe gets his job. Moshe is trying to figure out how to get the job done. And the purpose of the first dialogue is God's telling Moshe Rabbeinu, here's the master plan, and here's your job in the master plan. And otherwise, there's no way to understand this back and forth in the psukim. And then he says at the end, if you explain these psukim in any other manner, you're totally wrong. Now, Rashbam is really sure that he's right, isn't he? A Rashbam like this is almost unheard of. Rashbam rarely ever does this. But Rashbam is so convinced he's got it right that no one before him understood it. Now, I want to share with you this first Rashbam because we're gonna partially agree with the Rashbam and later disagree with the Rashbam about the lying part. We'll talk about it. There's no doubt, in my opinion, the Rashbam is right that that's God's strategy. That's the topic here: how to take them out of Egypt. Moshe is not trying to get out of his job; he's trying to understand how to get the job done. We'll deal with his reluctance later on to do the job. But this opening conversation at the burning bush, that's why I differentiate between Moshe Rabbeinu, first God getting Moshe Rabbeinu's attention and identifying himself as the God of his forefathers. And now here's a job I want you to do. Later we'll see how that identification relates a little bit to his job when we get to the Britot. But right now God's saying, here's your job. Moshe didn't say, I don't want to do the job. He's saying, I wish I could, but I can't. And help me do it. And God says to him, here's the plan. It's not your job to take him out. It's your job to run the place. And here's what you have to tell him. And this is the master plan. What's the master plan? Convince Pharaoh to let us go serve our God. Once we're out of Egypt and Har Sinai, from there, God will take it from there. Once we're out, use a religious excuse to get out, say you have to go serve your God. And we're going to see Rashbam is 100% right that that's the only thing God ever tells, that Moshe ever tells Pharaoh, send my people out to serve me in the desert. Remember? We'll prove that later on, and Rashbam's going to bring the proof. Now, there's a lot more to do here. I just wanted to open the surface. I just wanted to talk about that first conversation. If you have time on your own, try and read the rest of Perek Gimel and the conversation between God and Moshe Rabbeinu going back and forth. We'll continue with that. And we're going to see how, on the one hand, Rashbam is 100% right. On the other hand, there's something we're going to totally disagree with in the strategy. There's a different strategy. It's not a lie. We'll see why it's not a lie, and there's something much deeper going on. But we'll deal with that next week. Anyway, I have to, as they say, I have a plane to catch. So I'm going out to the airport. But thank you so much. And sorry it was in a different setup. But we're going, we'll stop here and we'll continue next week. Hopefully you're a little bit in suspense. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.